Good morning. So I would like to say again, thank you for having us here. Victoria and I are very happy to be in Baku and to be doing this training for trainers about the doing business indicators. As you mentioned, without further ado, we can start with the presentation regarding the starting a business indicator. So it is very important first to mention that there are case study assumptions for all 12 indicators of the Doing Business report, based on which we ask questions about what the procedures, time, and costs are, for example. The Starting a Business indicator is built on such case study assumptions, and we assume here that we have a company that's going to operate in the economy's largest business city. The form of the company is a limited liability company. It has between 10 to 50 employees. It performs general industrial and commercial activities. It is 100% domestically owned, so we don't assume that there is any foreign ownership. We assume that the company does not qualify for any investment incentive or any special tax treatments, and we assume that the company's startup capital is about 10 times income per capita. So what does the Starting a Business indicator measure? The indicator is divided into four main points. The first one assesses how long it takes to incorporate a limited liability company. This includes the phase of pre-registration, registration, and post-registration. And we'll be able to discuss a little bit more in details in the next slide what the time component includes. It's also important to measure that the time is measured in calendar days. The next component is about the cost. And the cost is calculated as the percentage of income per capita, and only the official costs are taken into account. So if there is a possibility of paying any sort of bribe in order to speed up the process, that is not taken into account. The third one is the procedures. So we check what are the procedures that are required to be done, also in order to obtain the incorporation documents and in order for the company to be able to start operating. And finally, the final component is about the paid-in minimum capital. And here we check how much capital should the founders put in a bank account, a deposit in a bank account, or with a notary, either before registration, at the time of registration, up to 3 months after incorporation. The paid-in minimum capital is recorded as a percentage of income per capita. These four indicators are valued equally. They're all valued at 25% of the total score of the indicator. If we look on the right of the slide, we can see that the indicator also is divided for the three components of the procedure, cost, and time to take into account if there are different rules and regulations that would apply to women and to men. So as I mentioned earlier, we check what are the procedures that are required to incorporate a company before registration, during registration, and up to 3 months after registration. And we take into account only the formal operations and the formal procedures that are needed in order to incorporate such a company. So what is included in each of those 3 steps? In the pre-registration stage, we check if there is a possibility or if there is a need to check for the availability of a company name. Sometimes this is considered as a separate step that is not included, for example, in the registration process. It could be a step that is done previously in order to ensure the name is available and in order to ensure the reservation of the name. We also check if there is a need for a notary to draft and notarize the company's incorporation documents, the statute, articles of incorporation. We also check if there is a need to deposit the paid-in minimum capital in a bank account. And in economies where there is a difference between laws that apply to women and men, we check if there is a need for the spouse to obtain approval before leaving the house to be able to register a business. During the registration phase, we analyze the application that is required to be completed in order to incorporate the company. We check what are the fees that have to be done during the registration. and any other procedures that are required to be done at the registry. Afterwards, we assess if there is a need to register with the tax authorities, and if yes, if these are separate procedures that should be done, or are they included in the registration documents. We check if there is a need to obtain a business license, if there is a need to enroll employees in Social Security, buying and legalizing the company books, and sometimes also a company seal is required for the operations of the company. And at this point, for example, as I mentioned, this is in the post-registration procedures. So if, for example, a company is required to obtain a company seal in order to do the regular activities like opening a bank account, if that is needed for the incorporation, then that is taken into account. So how are the procedures recorded? Every procedure that is recorded is an interaction of the company founders with external parties. And external parties are defined as government agencies, lawyers, auditors, notaries, or even spouses, if that is legally required for the spouse to obtain the approval of the spouse in order to carry out this incorporation procedure. Every procedure that is required by law and or commonly done in practice are recorded. And each electronic procedure is counted separately. And as I mentioned, we are taking into account what happened before registration, during registration, and after registrations. We also assume that the founders are going to complete all the procedures themselves, unless there is a need to hire a third party by law, or that is the practice done by the majority of entrepreneurs. Otherwise, we assume that the founders are going to complete those procedures themselves and not through a notary, for example, or a lawyer. We also take into account that if there is a need to go to different counters or different offices, even if they are within the same building, as separate procedures. We also assume that if there is a need to visit the same office several times, then each of these visits is going to be counted as a separate procedures. Whenever we have e-procedures, so procedures that can be completed online, even if they are done through the same website, but there is a need to have separate filings, then these would be considered as separate e-procedures. And every e-procedures will take about half a day, even if it can be done in less than half a day. Also, the approval from the spouse to own a business or to leave a home are also considered, as I mentioned earlier, as separate procedures if they are required by law, or if there are consequences for the spouse for not obtaining the approval to own the business or to leave the house, such as the loss of right to financial maintenance in case of divorce, for example. Procedures required for official correspondence or transactions with public agencies are also included. As I mentioned before, if a company needs to have a seal or it needs to have a bank account in order to be able to legally operate, then these procedures will be taken into account and will be counted towards the final number of procedures to incorporate the company. We move on to the time component. So we take into account the median duration that is indicated by the incorporation experts. So here we take into account what is being done in practice rather than what is mandated by law. And we take into account what's done with a minimum follow-up with government agencies, as I mentioned earlier, without the need to pay any extra amount. So here we're only looking at the formal procedures and the time that will be needed in order to complete these formal procedures without the need to pay any extra amount. We also take into account that the entrepreneur is aware of all entry requirements and will complete them without any delay. We take into account that if a procedure can be accelerated for an additional cost, then we're going to be taking into account that fastest procedure if it's the most beneficial to the economy. The minimum time required for each procedure that is done in person is 1 day. And as I mentioned earlier, the minimum time for each online procedure is half a day, even though it can be completed, for example, in just a matter of few minutes. And Although we also check for each procedure if it can be done at the same time than a previous procedure. However, even when that is possible, separate procedures cannot start on the same day. So the second procedure will always have to start on the next day. And the procedure is considered complete once the company receives the final incorporation documents. How is the cost of a procedure calculated? As I mentioned earlier, the cost includes all official fees and only official fees, and fees for legal or professional services if they are needed or if they're done by commonly done in practice or required by law. The company law and the commercial code and other specific regulations and fee schedules are used in order to identify what the costs are. And in the absence of such fee schedules, we take into account the estimates provided by government officers as an official source. Also, if there are several incorporation lawyers that provide different estimates, we will take into account the median reported value. How is the paid-in minimum capital measured? So the paid-in minimum capital requirement reflects the amount that business founders must deposit in a bank or with a notary, either before registration and up to 3 months after the incorporation of the company. The amount of the paid-in minimum capital is usually found in the commercial code or the company law. It would be specified there. Therefore, this point does not take into account what happens in practice, but what's the threshold or what's the amount that is mandated by law. Some economies require minimum capital, but allow businesses to pay only part of it before registration, and with the rest having to be paid after or within the first year of operation. Starting a business in general, as I mentioned, is an indicator that looks at the number of procedures, the time, the cost, and what's the minimum paid-in capital. And as we see in the slide, we have best performance around the world for each of those 4 indicators. So we have New Zealand and Georgia, who only require 1 procedure in order to incorporate a limited liability company. In New Zealand, the incorporation takes only half a day. In Slovenia, there is no cost that comes with the incorporation of a limited liability company. And there are 114 economies, and Australia, Colombia, and Malaysia, who do not require any minimum paid-in capital. So what are the main findings and good practices on the starting a business indicator? As I mentioned earlier, New Zealand is the top performer on the indicator of company incorporation. We have Georgia, Canada, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Jamaica, Australia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ireland, who are amongst the top 10 performer. So as we see, Azerbaijan ranks 9 out of 190 economies around the world. As of the May 1st, 2018, so as of the Doing Business 2019 report, Azerbaijan required 3 procedures in order to incorporate a limited liability company. We needed 3.5 days in order to incorporate it, and it cost 1.32% of the GNI per capita. It's important to note here that all the data that is published on this PowerPoint presentation has to do with the Doing Business 2019 report, which was published at the end of October 2018. It does not take into account any reforms or any changes that are happening, whether in practice or by law, that happened since May 2nd, 2018. This is a map of the world where it shows, depending on the color, the economies where it takes between 1 week and 1 month to start a business. As we mentioned earlier, we can see that in New Zealand, we have the fastest company incorporation time at half a day. Global good practices on company incorporation have to do with having the exact same requirements for a man and a woman to incorporate a limited liability company. All the procedures should be done online. There should be no paid-in minimum capital requirement. it will be it's advisable to create and improve the one-stop shop for company incorporations. It's good to have standardized forms or templates that founders can use in order to complete the incorporation of the company online. There shouldn't be any court involvement. It's good to have a fixed registration fee if there is a fee to be paid. And there should be no requirement to publish the incorporation of the company in legal journals. So what is the score on the starting a business indicator in Azerbaijan? Again, during the 2017 and 2018 years. So this data is valid up until May 2nd, 2018. So we see that Azerbaijan scored 96.14 on the starting a business indicator. The 96.14 is out of 100. It ranks 9 out of 190 economies around the world. And in this slide, we see a comparator economy, which is Georgia. And we see the score of ECA. So here we have the median score of Europe and Central Asia. And we have the median score for the OECD high-income economies. As we see in the number of procedures, Azerbaijan is performing better than ECA and OECD high-income on average. In terms of time, also Azerbaijan needs 3.5 days to complete incorporation procedures. In Georgia, companies are incorporated within 2 days. And again, I would like to mention that here we're talking only about limited liability companies. In ECA, it takes about 12.9 days, and in OECD high-income economies, it's 9.3 days. When it comes to the cost, as of May 2nd, 2018, Azerbaijan has the lowest cost out of Georgia, ECA, and OECD high-income economies. And as for the minimum capital, also Azerbaijan scores the highest possible score along with Georgia, and this is less than the median for ECA and OECD high-income economies. In this slide, we see also other economies comparators. We can see in yellow how Azerbaijan scores with regards to other economies. We can see Georgia, Kazakhstan, for example, and we can see the score on each of the procedures, time, cost, and minimum capital requirements. What are the reforms that were recorded in Azerbaijan in the Doing Business 2019 report? Last year, the data was still similar to the previous years. The team was informed that it's possible to apply for registration, obtain a TIN number, and then register for VAT. And we had made also a correction with regards to the cost of the procedure in Azerbaijan during the Doing Business 2019 report. The correction was related to obtaining an electronic signature for online registration, where it was previously believed that there is 13 manat that has to be paid in order to obtain one card reader. However, that cost was removed because it hasn't been used in practice, and companies have been using cell phones for authentications instead. So there was a correction done with regards to the time during the Doing Business 2019 report.